Family Guy has been on the air for more than 25 years. In that long stretch of time, the show has put its characters through more quiet damage than almost any other cartoon in television history. A best friend was killed in the street with no warning and no goodbye. A daughter spent 2 decades absorbing cruelty from the people who were supposed to protect her most. A dog, who presented himself as the most decent person in the house, used nearly everyone around him for something. A baby built weapons against his own mother for 10 straight seasons and never once pulled the trigger. A wife held a marriage together through years of neglect so normalized it stopped looking like neglect at all. A group of men sat on the same bar stools for 25 years and called it friendship while consistently failing each other in the ways that actually counted. Tonight, this video walks slowly through every major betrayal the show has ever built. You can listen with your eyes closed. You can fall asleep at any point and the video will keep going. Welcome to Red Umbrella. If you enjoy long, calm breakdowns like this one, the subscribe button helps the channel a lot. The show that made Betrayal a punchline. There is a moment in the very first season of Family Guy where Peter Griffin, without any particular malice, without any dramatic buildup, and without the slightest awareness that he is doing something worth noticing, simply fails the people around him. Not in a large cinematic way, not in a way that the show pauses to examine. He just does it. The scene moves on, and 30 seconds later, something completely unrelated is happening. A cutaway joke lands. The moment disappears. That pattern, more than any single character, more than any particular storyline, is what Family Guy actually is. It is a show built on the rhythm of people letting each other down and then continuing as if nothing happened. And somehow, across more than 2 decades of television, that rhythm never stopped being watchable. If anything, it became something people put on at night to fall asleep to, something familiar, something that hums in the background of a room and feels, in its strange way, like company. Understanding why requires going back to the beginning, not just to the first episode, but to the world the show built and the choice it made about what kind of people would live inside that world. Family Guy premiered on January 31st, 1999. Seth MacFarlane was 25 years old. He had spent years developing the characters, drawing from earlier short films he had made at the Rhode Island School of Design, and the show that eventually made it to Fox was a deliberately dysfunctional American family sitcom dressed up in the colors and chaos of an animated comedy. The premise was familiar enough. A father, a mother, 3 children, a dog, a house in a fictional Rhode Island town called Quahog. The setup borrowed freely from the decades of family sitcoms that came before it, and it never pretended otherwise. What it did differently was decide, almost immediately, that the emotional contract of the traditional sitcom, the one where the family ultimately holds together through warmth and mutual care, was something it had no interest in honoring. Peter Griffin was not Homer Simpson, though the comparisons were made constantly, and the show invited them. Homer, for all his bumbling and selfishness, was undergirded by something genuinely tender. His love for his family was real and returned. His failures were comic, but never quite poisonous. Peter was a different construction. Peter was louder, less reflective, more willing to act on impulse without a second thought for the people in his path. He was funny in a brasher, more chaotic way. And the show around him made a choice that would define everything that came after. It decided that the damage Peter caused would mostly go unexamined. The scene would end. The next gag would begin. The consequences would dissolve before they fully landed. That choice was, in its own way, a philosophy. The show was saying something about how dysfunction actually works in families and in friendships. Real neglect does not announce itself with dramatic music. Real betrayal between people who love each other often does not even register as betrayal in the moment it happens. It registers later, quietly, in the accumulation of small things that nobody called out when they were small. Family Guy took that observation and turned it into a comedic engine. The laugh track covered what would otherwise feel like wounds. The cutaway interrupted what might have become a reckoning, and the show continued. For a long time, the critical conversation around Family Guy focused on what it was not. It was not as emotionally intelligent as The Simpsons. It was not as politically precise as South Park. It was not interested in the kind of serialized character development that prestige television was beginning to explore around the same time. Critics were not entirely wrong about any of that, but they were missing what the show was actually doing underneath its chaos, which was building one of the most detailed and honest portraits of low-grade, constant, mutual disappointment that American television has ever produced. Quahog, the town where the Griffins live, is not a happy place pretending to be happy. It is a place where everybody is performing contentment while quietly enduring the ways the people closest to them have let them down. Lois has accepted a marriage that does not give her the partnership she deserved. Meg has absorbed years of dismissal from the family that was supposed to be her stronger foundation. Brian has built an identity as the thoughtful one, the sensitive one, the one with perspective. And underneath that identity is a person who consistently fails the people who depend on him. Even Stewie, the baby genius who spends the early seasons plotting elaborate revenge against his own mother, is driven by something that looks a lot like the pain of not feeling seen. These are not characters in a vacuum. They are a system. And the system is held together not by love exactly, but by the peculiar gravity of people who have nowhere else to go and who have learned to absorb each other's failures as the price of staying together. The show ran for 3 seasons, was canceled by Fox in 2002, and came back in 2005 after DVD sales and reruns on Adult Swim demonstrated that the audience for it was larger and more devoted than the network had understood. That return matters in the context of Betrayal because the show that came back was, in certain ways, more willing to lean into its own darkness. The revival-era Family Guy pushed harder. The emotional stakes of certain episodes rose in ways the early seasons rarely attempted. And the characters, over time, accumulated a history with each other that made their failures carry more weight. By the time the show reached its 8th, 9th, and 10th seasons, Meg Griffin had been through enough that a single episode about a hurricane could become something genuinely heartbreaking. By season 12, Brian and Stewie's friendship had been developed across enough episodes that killing Brian could cause a real, measurable wave of grief among the show's audience. These reactions were not accidental. They were the product of 2 decades of small moments, of betrayals that the show never quite paused to examine, quietly adding up. There is something worth sitting with in the format itself. Family Guy's signature structure is the cutaway gag, the sudden lurch away from the scene at hand into a disconnected joke or reference, then back again. Critics have written about this for years, mostly focusing on how it affects comedic pacing. But the cutaway does something else, something that is easy to miss if it is only being evaluated as a comedic device. It prevents resolution. Every time a moment of genuine emotional consequence begins to breathe, the cutaway ends it. The scene jumps elsewhere. The character who was just hurt or dismissed or failed is, when the show returns, simply continuing. The wound is covered before it can be acknowledged. That structure, across hundreds of episodes, creates a very specific emotional texture. The viewer absorbs the failure, the dismissal, the small cruelty, and then is immediately moved past it by a joke. The feeling does not go away. It accumulates. And accumulation is exactly what makes Family Guy's betrayals land the way they do, in the episodes where the show finally allows a moment to sit without a cutaway to dissolve it. Peter is the most obvious engine of this. He is the one who most consistently makes choices that cost other people something real. He embarrasses Lois in public and then expects the warmth of the marriage he has not been maintaining. He dismisses Meg with a reflexive cruelty that long ago stopped being purely comic. He drags his friends into situations that damage them in ways the show usually treats as background noise. Peter is funny. He is also, if the show is watched with any sustained attention, something of a quiet disaster for everyone near him. But Peter is not the only source of betrayal in this world, and that is what makes the show worth the hours it demands. Brian betrays people from a position of moral authority, which is its own particular kind of damage. Lois betrays Meg through the specific harm of a parent who consistently chooses the easier path. Stewie's war against his own family has real targets behind the comedy. Quagmire, Joe, Cleveland, the friends who gather at the Drunken Clam every week, have a friendship that is, on close examination, almost entirely transactional. And underneath all of it, the show itself made choices about its characters that could reasonably be called betrayals of its own. The writers who shaped Meg into the family's punching bag, the decision to kill Brian for a ratings moment, the slow transformation of Peter from a lovable idiot into something that occasionally reads as genuinely unkind. These are creative choices, but they have a texture that mirrors exactly what the show depicts: the casual, unremarked upon damage that comes from never quite deciding what something or someone is worth. Over the sections that follow, each of those threads is going to be pulled slowly apart. The marriages and friendships, the parent-child bonds, the relationship between a dog and a baby that somehow became the emotional heart of the whole show. Each one carries its own record of small failures and occasional large ones. Each one is in its way a version of the same story the show has been telling since 1999. Family Guy did not set out to be a show about betrayal. It set out to be a loud, irreverent, joke-per-minute animated comedy that pushed at the edges of what a network cartoon could get away with. But the thing it built across all those seasons and all those those cutaway gags and all those moments where a character absorbed something they should not have had to absorb and then simply continued, is something more specific and more honest than that original ambition suggests. It built a portrait of people who care about each other in ways they rarely manage to act on, who fail each other in ways they rarely acknowledge, and who keep coming back to the same house, the same bar, the same set of relationships. Not because everything is fine, but because that is simply what people do. That is what this video is about, not the worst moments. Exactly, not a collection of the cruelest jokes or the most obvious examples of characters being unkind. Something slower and more interesting than that. The full picture of what it means that a show can spend 25 years depicting dysfunction and still have people watching it every night before they fall asleep. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Family Guy built its entire identity around people letting each other down without ever stopping to notice. Next, that pattern moves to the center of the show, Peter and Lois, and what their marriage actually looked like up close. Section 2, Peter and Lois, when love looks like neglect. There is a version of Peter and Lois Griffin that the show presents in its earliest episodes as something almost sweet. Two people from completely different worlds who somehow found each other and made something work. Lois came from money, from the Pewterschmidt family, one of the wealthiest in Rhode Island. Peter came from nowhere in particular, a big, loud, not especially thoughtful man who worked at a brewery and loved his friends and his television and his beer. The match should not have made sense. The show knew that, and in the beginning, the gap between them was played as a source of warmth rather than damage. That warmth did not last. Not because the show lost interest in their relationship, but because the show slowly revealed what that relationship actually looked like from the inside. And what it looked like, across season after season, was a woman absorbing an enormous amount of carelessness from a man who genuinely believed he was doing fine. Peter Griffin is not a villain. That distinction matters, and it is worth holding on to throughout everything that follows. He does not set out to hurt Lois. He does not calculate his neglect. He simply moves through the world with an almost complete inability to register the effect he has on the people closest to him. And Lois is the person who absorbs the most of that over the longest period of time. 25 years of episodes. 25 years of moments where she adjusted, forgave, redirected, or simply absorbed what he did and kept the household moving. The show established early on that Peter had a way of making significant decisions without consulting her. Not occasionally, routinely. He would take on a new job, make a major financial commitment, invite chaos into their lives, and Lois would find out the way she found out about most things, after the fact, when the consequences were already in motion. There's a pattern to this across the seasons that becomes clearer the longer the show runs. Peter acts, Lois reacts. The episode resolves. The next episode begins with the same dynamic intact. Season 3 contains one of the cleaner, early examples of what this looks like in practice. The episode is called Death Lives, and its premise is built around Peter being given a second chance at life after a near-death experience, on the condition that he does something genuinely kind for Lois. What makes the episode worth paying attention to is not the supernatural framing, but what is revealed inside it. Peter, guided through memories of his marriage by the figure of death, discovers that he has spent years doing exactly what has already been described here, taking Lois for granted in ways so constant and so normalized that he had stopped seeing them as choices at all. He had sent her on a fake scavenger hunt so he could skip their wedding anniversary and go golfing with his friends. He had done this without apparent guilt. The anniversary was a fact he was aware of and had decided, without much deliberation, to not let interfere with his plans. The episode ends warmly enough. Peter comes to his senses, makes a gesture, and the marriage is restored to its working order. But the restoration is the part that deserves the most scrutiny, because it happens so cleanly and so quickly. Lois forgives, the episode ends, and the underlying pattern that made the forgiveness necessary is never examined. It will produce another moment requiring forgiveness in a future episode, and that moment will also be forgiven, and the cycle will continue. That cycle is the actual subject of Peter and Lois as a couple. Not any single betrayal, but the rhythm of failure and forgiveness that the show built into the architecture of their marriage so deeply that it eventually stopped reading as drama and started reading as weather, something that simply happened regularly and was endured. Lois is a genuinely interesting character in the context of that cycle because she is not passive. She is not a woman who simply accepts everything without response. She pushes back. She has her own breaking points and her own moments of choosing something for herself rather than for the family. But the show consistently returns her to the same position, which is the person person who holds the Griffin household together by absorbing whatever Peter releases into it. Her competence is what makes his incompetence livable. Her patience is what keeps the damage from becoming irreparable. And the show, by making this dynamic the engine of so many episodes, essentially argues that the arrangement is functional. Not good, exactly, but functional. There's an episode in season 4 called The Cleveland-Loretta Quagmire, where infidelity enters the story through the Brown marriage rather than the Griffin one. But the episode does something interesting in the way it positions Peter's response to Cleveland's situation. Peter becomes deeply invested in the idea that Loretta's betrayal of Cleveland is unconscionable, that loyalty in a marriage is not negotiable, that what she did was genuinely wrong. He says this with conviction. He believes it. And the show lets him say it without pointing out that Peter's own record of loyalty to Lois is, depending on the episode, complicated at best. The gap between what Peter believes about marriage in the abstract and what he actually practices inside his own is not addressed. The show moves on, but the gap remains visible if the right attention is being paid. Jealousy is another thread that runs through Peter and Lois across multiple seasons. Peter's jealousy tends to arrive suddenly and with disproportionate intensity. When Lois makes a connection with another man, even a professional or entirely innocent one, something in Peter responds with a force that does not match the situation. The season 3 episode Stuck Together, Torn Apart explores this directly. Peter's jealousy escalates to the point where he and Lois try a temporary separation, and what the episode reveals in that separation is that both of them are, in their way, lost without the other. Lois discovers she can attract attention easily when she is on her own. Peter discovers he cannot manage the emotional reality of Lois being anywhere he is not. They reunite. The jealousy that caused the separation is not resolved so much as set aside by the relief of being back together. That relief is real in the show. There is genuine feeling in the way Peter and Lois find their way back to each other across various episodes, and dismissing it entirely would misread what the show is doing. But relief is different from repair. Coming back together after a crisis is not the same as addressing what produced the crisis. And Peter and Lois, across 25 seasons, have had a great many reunions without a proportionate number of actual repairs. The later seasons push this further. As the show aged and the character of Peter became broader and sometimes harder to sympathize with, his treatment of Lois shifted in register. The carelessness that defined his earlier failures began to shade into something that occasionally felt less like obliviousness and more like indifference. Episodes where Lois's feelings, her needs, her basic dignity as a partner were treated as inconveniences to be briefly acknowledged before the story moved on to whatever Peter wanted to do next. The show was not always fully aware of this shift, which is part of what makes it worth naming. Lois herself changed across the run. She had periods of her own selfishness, her own cruelties, her own moments of failing the people around her. The show made sure she was not simply a martyr, and that choice was the right one. A Lois who only absorbed and never acted out would have been a different kind of dishonest. But even in the episodes where Lois behaved badly, there was usually a thread connecting her behavior back to the accumulated weight of what she had been carrying. She was not acting out from nowhere. She was acting out from somewhere very specific, and that somewhere was the marriage she had spent years holding together at cost to herself. There is one more thing worth saying about Peter and Lois before the story moves elsewhere. The show, for all its chaos, for all its cutaways and its comedic noise, never actually broke them up. They were canceled before they could be destroyed in the original run. They survived the revival. They survived every crisis the writers introduced. The marriage persisted. And there is something in that persistence that is either a testament to the depth of what they have, or an indictment of the inertia that keeps people in arrangements that do not fully serve them. Family Guy never quite decided which one it meant. It kept the marriage alive and let both readings exist at once, which is possibly the most honest thing it ever did on this particular subject, because that is how many long relationships actually work. Not through continuous happiness or even continuous effort, through a kind of gravity that keeps two people circling each other long after the original reasons for the orbit have become hard to name. Peter and Lois are held together by history, by children, by habit, by moments of genuine warmth that surface between longer stretches of quiet difficulty. That combination is not romantic in the conventional sense, but it is recognizable. And recognition, more than almost anything else, is what has kept this show on the air. The carelessness Peter showed Lois over 2 decades of television was never truly reckoned with by the show. It was occasionally acknowledged, briefly examined, and then filed away as the cost of the arrangement. Lois paid that cost. She kept paying it. And and the show asked its audience to find this funny, and then poignant, and then funny again, cycling through those registers so many times that the audience eventually stopped distinguishing between them and simply accepted the whole texture as normal. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Peter and Lois showed what neglect looks like when it wears the face of love. The next section turns to Brian Griffin, the one character who always believed he was better than this show, and the long record of moments that proved otherwise. Section 3. Brian's betrayal of everyone who trusted him. Brian Griffin is the character Family Guy asks the audience to trust most. Not love most, necessarily, though many viewers do love him. Trust. He is the one who reads books, the one who drinks martinis and talks about literature, and holds considered opinions about the world. He is the one who, when Peter does something thoughtless or Quagmire says something appalling, occupies the position of the reasonable person in the room, the dog who sees clearly, the one with perspective. That positioning is doing a very specific kind of work in the show, and it takes a while to see what that work actually is. Brian is not placed at the moral center of Family Guy because he belongs there. He is placed there because the show needs somewhere to put the moral center. And Brian is the character whose surface presentation most closely resembles what a moral center looks like. The gap between that presentation and what Brian actually does across 20+ seasons of episodes is one of the most quietly devastating things the show ever built. Start with the most basic version of the failure. Brian presents himself as someone who cares deeply about the people around him. He talks about his relationships with genuine-sounding warmth. He positions himself, in conversation after conversation, as the person in the Griffin household who actually pays attention to what others are going through. And then, in episode after episode, he demonstrates that his attention is almost entirely conditional. When caring about someone is convenient, when it costs him nothing, when it aligns with something he already wanted to do, Brian cares. When it requires him to sacrifice something, to be uncomfortable, to actually show up in a way that does not also serve his own interests, Brian finds a reason to be elsewhere. The relationship with Stewie is the place where this pattern is most visible, because it is the relationship the show develops most carefully over its entire run. Brian and Stewie are, in the mythology of Family Guy, best friends. The Road 2 episodes, the bottle episode in the bank vault in season 8, the grief of season 12 when Brian dies and Stewie is left without him, all of this builds the impression of a genuine and irreplaceable bond. And that bond is real in the moments when the show chooses to honor it, but it is also interrupted, repeatedly, by Brian doing things to Stewie that have no justification inside the logic of a real friendship. The Herpy storyline is one of the clearest examples. In the season 12 episode, Herpy the Love Sore, Brian and Stewie perform a blood brother ritual, cutting their hands and pressing them together. It is a moment of genuine bonding, played with the kind of warmth that the show occasionally allows into their dynamic. What the audience learns afterward is that Brian already knew he had herpes when the ritual happened. He had not mentioned it. He had allowed Stewie, a baby who trusts him completely, to participate in something that would give Stewie a disease he would carry for life. And Brian had said nothing. When this comes out, his explanation is that he was embarrassed. Stewie, after some attempts at revenge, forgives him. The episode ends. Brian carries no lasting consequence from having given his best friend a lifelong condition through deliberate concealment. The show treats this as a comedic premise, and in the rhythm of the episode, it functions that way. But underneath the comedy is a choice Brian made, a conscious one, that prioritized his own discomfort over Stewie's basic right to know what he was agreeing to. That is not a small thing. Dressed up in different clothes, in a different kind of story, it would be immediately recognizable as a serious breach of trust. Family Guy's format softens it. The softening does not erase what happened. Then there is the matter of Brian's son, Dylan. The episode Brian's a Bad Father in season 12 follows Brian reconnecting with a son he had largely ignored for years. The premise could have been a genuine examination of what it means to fail a child through absence. Instead, what the episode reveals is that Brian's interest in reconnecting with Dylan is driven not by guilt or genuine paternal feeling, but by the discovery that Dylan has become a successful actor. Brian sees an opportunity. He uses the reconnection to try to advance his own writing career, leveraging his son's industry connections to get his work read by people who would otherwise ignore him. When Dylan realizes what is happening, he pulls away. Brian, rather than acknowledging what he has done, uses Stewie to carry an apology on his behalf, outsourcing even the act of making things right to someone else. The writing career is a thread that runs through Brian's betrayals in a specific way. Brian's self-image is built almost entirely on his identity as a writer. He believes himself to be a serious literary talent who has not yet received the recognition he deserves. deserves. This belief is one of the show's most sustained running jokes, because Brian's actual writing is consistently described as not very good. But the joke has a darker edge than it first appears, because Brian's pursuit of that identity leads him to use people. He uses Dylan. He positions himself in relationships and situations that might advance his career. He accepts help and attention from others under the pretense of mutual connection, when the connection is, at least partly, instrumental. The Lois situation deserves its own examination. In the season 6 episode, Play It Again, Brian, the show takes Brian's long-standing attraction to Lois, which had been a background element of his character for years, and brings it to an uncomfortable foreground. During a trip to Martha's Vineyard, Peter leaves Brian and Lois together for extended periods. Brian's feelings intensify. He tries to kiss her, not as a joke, not as a miscommunication, but as a deliberate action taken toward his best friend's wife, a woman he lives with, in a house where Peter has extended him years of trust and hospitality. Lois rejects him. The aftermath is handled relatively quickly. Brian apologizes. The friendship with Peter continues. But what happened is not a small thing, and the speed with which the show moves past it is itself a kind of commentary, intentional or not, on how Brian's failures tend to be processed in the world of Quahog, quickly, without full accounting. Quagmire has a famous monologue about Brian in the season 8 episode Jerome is the New Black. It is one of the most direct pieces of character criticism in the show's entire run, a sustained and specific takedown delivered with unusual conviction for a Family Guy scene. Quagmire tells Brian, plainly and in detail, exactly what he thinks of him. He calls out the pretension, the self-absorption, the gap between Brian's self-presentation and his actual behavior. He mentions the attraction to Lois. He challenges the literary self-image. He says things that most characters in most episodes simply do not say to each other in this show. The monologue was written as a comedic scene, and audiences received it that way, but it is also, on examination, almost entirely accurate. Every specific charge Quagmire levels at Brian is supportable by the record of what the show had depicted over the previous seasons. The drinking that tips from character quirk into genuine problem. The condescension toward people he considers his intellectual inferiors. The way his liberal politics and his stated values sit in uncomfortable contrast with how he actually treats the people in his life. Quagmire, of all characters, is not a credible moral authority, but that does not make what he says wrong. And the fact that Brian has no real response to it, that he is mostly just stung rather than able to refute anything, is quietly telling. What makes Brian's betrayals accumulate into something worth examining at length is not that any single one of them is catastrophic. Most are not. Most are the kind of thing that, in isolation, could be forgiven without much difficulty. The herpes incident, on its own. The Dylan situation, on its own. The moment with Lois, taken separately from everything else. Each one is manageable. But Brian is not a character who commits one of these failures and then genuinely changes. He commits them in a pattern. The pattern is consistent across seasons, across different relationships, across different circumstances. And the pattern reveals something that the surface presentation of Brian Griffin is specifically designed to conceal, which is that he is a deeply self-centered person who has built an elaborate identity around the idea that he is not. That gap between who Brian believes himself to be and who he repeatedly demonstrates himself to be is the most honest thing the show ever did with him. Not the Road 2 episodes, as wonderful as some of them are. Not the Vault episode, for all its genuine emotional depth. The most honest thing is the accumulation of small failures, the repeated pattern of Brian choosing himself while maintaining the posture of someone who would never do that. He is not the only one in Quahog who does this, but he is the one who does it while holding the role of the person who knows better. And that particular combination, self-awareness without self-correction, is its own specific kind of betrayal. The kind that is hardest to call out because the person committing it has already established themselves as the one who would be the first to call it out in someone else. Family Guy understood this about Brian, whether it always intended to or not. The show kept writing him back into the same patterns, even as it occasionally gave him episodes of genuine depth and warmth. The depth was real, so was the pattern. Both things were true at the same time, and the show, in its best moments, let them coexist without resolving the tension between them. That tension, a character who is genuinely capable of care and genuine warmth, and also genuinely capable of using people without fully admitting it to himself, is more interesting than either a simple villain or a simple good person would have been. Brian Griffin is neither. He is something messier and more familiar than either of those options, which is, in the end, what makes his failures land the way they do. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Brian's failures were quiet and persistent, dressed in the clothing of good intentions. The next section arrives at the moment the show could no longer keep its most important friendship off screen, when Stewie lost Brian entirely and the audience felt every second of it. Section 4. The Death of Brian and What Stewie Lost. Some episodes of television announce themselves as important before anything has happened. The music shifts, the pacing slows. There is a quality to the air of the thing that tells the audience to pay attention, that something is coming that will matter. Life of Brian, the 6th episode of Family Guy's 12th season, which aired on November 24th, 2013, does not do any of that. It begins the way hundreds of Family Guy episodes begin. Brian and Stewie are together, doing something slightly absurd, and the show is in its normal register, moving at its normal pace, generating its normal texture of jokes and cutaways, and the comfortable rhythm that longtime viewers know without having to think about it. That normalcy is the whole point, and understanding why requires sitting with the episode slowly, from the beginning, rather than jumping to the moment everyone remembers. The episode opens with Brian and Stewie returning from a time travel adventure that has gone sideways, as their time travel adventures tend to do. They had gone back to 17th century Jamestown, and in the course of being there, they had given guns to Native Americans, which altered the course of history in ways that required them to go back and correct their mistake. It is the kind of premise the show had used before in various forms. Stewie's time machine had been a recurring element across several seasons, a device that allowed the writers to send Brian and Stewie into unusual situations and use the isolation of those situations to dig into the friendship between them. The time travel episodes were, as a category, some of the better Brian and Stewie material the show produced. They stripped away the rest of the cast and forced the two characters to simply exist together, which is when the show was most honest about what they meant to each other. After correcting the damage in Jamestown and returning to the present, Stewie makes a decision. He is tired of the close calls. He is tired of the near disasters and the history-altering accidents and the constant anxiety of having a device capable of destroying everything if used carelessly. He destroys the time machine. He takes it apart, crushes the remains, and disposes of them at a junkyard. It is a clean, decisive action, the kind of choice that feels like maturity, like Stewie recognizing that some tools are too dangerous to keep around, regardless of how useful they are. The moment the time machine is gone, Brian finds a street hockey net at the junkyard. They take it home. They set it up in the street outside the Griffin house. Stewie goes inside to get his knee pads. Brian is hit by a car. There is no build-up to it. There is no dramatic music cue or slow-motion sequence or meaningful glance between the characters before it happens. A car comes down the street and strikes Brian, and the show does not soften it or distance it through comedic framing. Brian is injured badly. The family rushes him to the veterinarian. The waiting room scene that follows is quiet in a way that Family Guy almost never allows itself to be quiet. Peter, Lois, the children, Stewie, all of them sitting with the weight of what might be about to happen, and the show not cutting away from it, not interrupting it with a joke, not giving the audience an escape route. Brian recovers enough to speak before he dies. He tells the family that he has had a wonderful life because of them. He tells them he loves them, and then he is gone. The scene is played straight, not satirically, not with the winking self-awareness that the show used to keep its more emotional moments at arm's length. It is simply a scene of loss, handled with more gentleness than the show had demonstrated it was capable of in years. The audience reaction was immediate and intense in a way that surprised even the people who made the show. Seth MacFarlane later stated publicly that the team had expected the episode to generate some reaction, but that the scale of the response, the genuine grief and anger that spread across social media and fan communities within hours of the episode airing, was not something they had fully anticipated. A hashtag asking for Brian's return began trending. Petitions were started. People who had watched the show casually for years found themselves unexpectedly devastated by the death of an animated dog they had never consciously decided to love. That reaction is worth examining carefully, because it reveals something important about what the show had actually built with Brian and Stewie over the years leading up to this episode. The grief people felt was not really about Brian in isolation. It was about Brian and Stewie. It was about the specific texture of that friendship. The years of Road to episodes and vault conversations and small moments of genuine connection embedded between the chaos of the show's broader comedy. People had absorbed all of that without necessarily tracking it consciously, and the removal of Brian made the weight of it suddenly visible. What had been background warmth became, in its absence, something that felt enormous. For Stewie, the loss had a particular shape. Stewie Griffin Brian is, depending on the episode, a diabolical genius, a comedic engine, a surprisingly vulnerable child, and occasionally all three at once. His relationship with Brian was the one consistent place in the show where his vulnerability was allowed to exist without being immediately undercut. Brian was the person Stewie could be honest with, the person he could admit things to that he would not admit anywhere else, including the feelings that sat underneath the schemes and the grandiose pronouncements and the elaborate plans. Brian knew Stewie in a way that no one else in the Griffin household did, and Stewie knew it, and the knowledge of it was the foundation of everything between them. The moment Stewie realizes Brian is gone and that the time machine he destroyed is the only thing that could have saved him is the emotional center of the episode. Not the death itself, but that realization. Stewie had made a reasonable decision. He had looked at the time machine and correctly identified it as dangerous and decided the responsible thing was to remove it from the equation. And in the exact moment that decision stopped being reversible, the one situation arose that made him need it more than he had ever needed anything. He tries to rebuild it. He reaches out to the dealer who had supplied him with parts before. The parts are unavailable. The door is closed. Brian is gone, and the mechanism that could undo it is irretrievably dismantled. And Stewie, for all his genius, for all his technology and planning and capacity to outthink virtually every situation he encounters, cannot fix this one. That helplessness is one of the most precisely written things the show ever did with Stewie as a character, because Stewie's entire identity is built around never being helpless. He is the one who always has a plan, the one for whom problems are puzzles to be solved rather than conditions to be endured. Removing that capacity, placing him in a situation where his intelligence and his resources and his extraordinary abilities are simply not enough, is a form of grief that is specific to who he is. Other characters grieve Brian through sadness. Stewie grieves him through the particular anguish of someone who knows exactly what would fix the situation and cannot access it. The family, in the weeks following Brian's death, adopts a new dog named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico, who was well known at the time for his work on The Sopranos. Vinny is a talking dog from New York, warmer in certain ways than Brian, funnier in a different register, and the show made genuine efforts to establish him as a character worth caring about. Some viewers responded to Vinny with more openness than others. The critical and fan consensus, however, was that Vinny occupied Brian's space in the household without filling it. He was present where Brian had been present, without carrying the history that Brian had carried. The show knew this. Stewie's resistance to Vinny in the episodes following Brian's death is not just a plot element. It is an accurate depiction of what grief actually does, how it makes the replacement of something lost feel not just inadequate, but faintly offensive, as if accepting the replacement would require agreeing that the original was replaceable. Stewie does not accept this. He spends the post-Brian episodes in a state of interior mourning that the show handles with more delicacy than might have been expected. He is not theatrical about it. He does not perform his grief for the other characters. He carries it quietly, in the way that people who are not accustomed to being without something fundamental carry the absence of it. There is a scene where Vinny finds Stewie crying and sits with him, and it is one of the gentler scenes the show produced in this period. Vinny not trying to replace Brian or dismiss the grief, but simply being present with it. The scene works because it does not oversell itself. It is just two characters in a room with a loss that cannot be argued away. The resolution comes in the Christmas episode that followed, titled Christmas Guy, in which Stewie encounters a version of himself from a different point on the timeline and borrows that version's time machine return pad. He uses it to go back to the moment just before Brian is struck by the car and warns him. Brian moves. The car misses him. He comes back. The reunion is not played as a triumph. It is played as relief, which is a different thing. Triumph has energy in it, a sense of having won something. Relief is what happens when something you thought was permanently gone turns out not to be, and the predominant feeling is not joy, but the quiet aftermath of having been very afraid. Stewie hugs Brian, and the hug is not funny. The show does not undercut it. It simply allows it to be what it is, which is a child holding on to someone he thought he had lost. The audience that had been grieving alongside Stewie for the 3 episodes between Brian's death and his return responded to that hug with something that looked, in the fan discussions and comment sections of the time, very much like the same relief the show was depicting. People had been genuinely waiting, genuinely hoping, and when it resolved the way it resolved, the feeling was not that the show had cheated by bringing Brian back, though some critics argued exactly that. The feeling was that something had been restored that the show could not have continued properly without. What the Life of Brian episode ultimately reveals, beneath all of its plot mechanics and its emotional manipulation and its willingness to make an audience genuinely grieve for 3 weeks, is the true weight of the Brian and Stewie relationship in the architecture of Family Guy. It is not decoration. It is not a recurring bit. It is the load-bearing beam of the show's emotional structure. Remove it, and the whole thing wobbles in ways that no amount of Vinny can correct. The show demonstrated this not by describing it, but by removing Brian and letting the audience feel the instability directly. That is a confident, creative choice. It is also, depending on how generously it is read, either a genuine act of storytelling or a calculated experiment in audience manipulation for the purpose of generating attention. Seth MacFarlane's comments about being surprised by the scale of the reaction suggest the latter was at least partly in play. The writers knew killing Brian would provoke a response. They may not have known how large that response would be, but the decision to do it was not made in ignorance of its emotional mechanics. Both things can be true simultaneously. The episode can be a ratings calculation and a genuinely moving piece of television at the same time. The grief the audience felt was real, regardless of the intention behind the mechanism that produced it. And the grief said something that no episode of Family Guy had said quite so clearly before, which is that the show, for all its chaos and all its cutaways and all its years of treating emotion as something to be briefly visited and quickly escaped, had quietly made people care about these characters far more than they had consciously realized. Stewie lost Brian for 3 episodes in 2013. The loss lasted less than a month of real time. In the world of the show, it lasted long enough to change something, to make the friendship visible in a way it had not been before, to give both characters a weight of shared history that every subsequent episode between them carried forward. That is what grief does when it is handled honestly. It does not simply hurt and then end. It recalibrates. It changes what was there before into something that now has a different quality, a tenderness around it that was not present, or at least not visible before the loss. Brian and Stewie after Life of Brian are the same characters they were before it, but the audience's relationship to them is different. The vulnerability has been exposed. The stakes have been named. And the show, whether it intended to or not, can never fully put that back in the box. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Brian's death showed how much a single absence could unmake the show's emotional center. The next section turns to a different kind of loss, the one that happens slowly, across 20 years, to the one character in Quahog who never got a moment of rescue. Section 5. Meg and the family that forgot her. Meg Griffin has been in every season of Family Guy. She has been present in hundreds of episodes across more than 25 years of television. She lives in the Griffin house, sits at the Griffin table, rides in the Griffin car, and shares a last name with people who, across the entire run of the show, have treated her with a consistency of dismissal so complete and so normalized that it eventually stopped registering as cruelty and started registering as atmosphere. Just the way things are in that house. Just the weather of being Meg. That normalization is the most interesting thing about her situation, and it is worth sitting with before anything else. The abuse directed at Meg, because that is the accurate word for a significant portion of what she receives from her family, does not announce itself as abuse. It arrives dressed as comedy. It arrives in the form of Peter saying, "Shut up, Meg," and the laugh track affirming the joke. It arrives in Lois's occasional inability to prioritize her daughter's feelings over the convenience of the moment. It arrives in the way the show itself, across 2 decades, made Meg the receptacle for every joke that needed a target and every plot that needed someone to absorb a consequence. The comedy framing does not change what is underneath it. It just makes it easier to absorb without fully registering. Meg Griffin was voiced in the first season by Lacey Chabert, and from the second season onward by Mila Kunis, who has continued in the role ever since. MacFarlane has spoken about what Meg represented as a character, a kind of comedic punching bag, whose function was to embody the embarrassment and social pain of adolescence in its most concentrated form. That function was established early and maintained with remarkable consistency. And what makes it more than just a running joke, what makes it worth examining at the length this section is going to examine it, is the fact that the show periodically remembered that Meg was a person underneath the function, periodically gave her episodes that treated her inner life as real, and then, just as consistently, returned her to the same position it had always placed her in, as if those episodes of humanity had never happened. Start with Peter, because Peter is where the most visible damage originates. Peter Griffin's treatment of his eldest daughter across the show's run is one of the more sustained portraits of parental failure in the history of American animated television. And it is painted almost entirely in the colors of comedy. He forgets her birthday. He embarrasses her in front of her peers with a reflexive thoughtlessness that suggests he has never once considered the effect of his presence on her social life. He makes jokes at her expense in rooms full of people. He tells her to shut up with such frequency and such automaticity that it long ago stopped being a response to anything she actually said and became simply his default setting in her presence. There is an episode in the later seasons called 3 Acts of God, in which Peter and his friends go on a quest to find God and make a series of requests. Peter, having gained access to a deity with the power to alter reality, uses one of his wishes to make Meg disappear from existence. Not temporarily inconvenience her, not send her somewhere else, remove her from existence entirely. The episode treats this as a comedic beat, and in the rhythm of Family Guy, it functions as one. But the choice the writers made, to have Peter use a wish of literally infinite potential specifically to erase his own daughter from reality, is not a small thing when it is held up to any light at all. It says something about how completely Peter has internalized Meg's non-existence as desirable. He does not wish for money or power or any of the things that might be expected. His mind goes to Meg. The show was aware, at least some of the time, of the darkness in this material. There are episodes that address it directly, that pull the camera back and look at what is actually happening to Meg with something approaching honesty. The most famous of these is Seahorse Seashell Party from season 10, which will be examined in its own section because it deserves that space. But others exist across the run that are worth naming here as evidence of the show's periodic willingness to look at what it had built. Dial Meg for Murder from season 8 is one of the better ones. The premise is that Meg begins a relationship with a prison inmate through a pen pal program, and when the man escapes from prison, he comes to the Griffin house to hide with her. Brian, discovering the situation, calls the police. The result is that Meg is arrested and sentenced to 3 months in prison for harboring a fugitive. The sentence is unjust by any reasonable standard. Meg's crime was caring about someone who misled her, and the consequence is incarceration. Nobody in the Griffin family prevents this from happening. Meg returns from prison changed, harder, more physically confident. She has learned to survive in an environment far more brutal than the one that broke her, and the survival has left marks. She comes home and begins taking from the family what the family has taken from her for years. She intimidates Peter. She asserts herself in ways the household has never seen from her. There is something cathartic in these scenes for anyone who has spent years watching Meg absorb punishment without response. The show allows her a period of power that feels earned, and then it ends. Brian talks to her. He tells her she did well, that standing up for herself was right, that what she did took strength. And Meg, having heard this, looks at the family dynamics around her, sees how Peter's behavior in response to her assertiveness has turned the family members against each other, and makes a decision. She will go back. She will return to being the lightning rod, the one who absorbs the family's dysfunction so that it does not destroy the relationships between everyone else. She apologizes. The family reconciles. The equilibrium is restored. That ending is one of the most quietly devastating things the show ever did. Not because it is cruel exactly, but because it is presented as mature. Brian calls it maturity. He tells Meg she is the strongest person in the family, and Meg accepts this framing, this idea that her willingness to continue absorbing what should not be hers to absorb is a form of strength rather than a form of surrender. The show does not entirely endorse this reading. It lets the discomfort of it sit in the scene without fully resolving it, but it also does not push back against it hard enough to change anything. By the next episode, Meg is back where she has always been, and the show continues. What the show does with Lois in relation to Meg is a different kind of failure, and in some ways a more painful one. Peter's cruelty toward Meg is so broad and so cartoonish that it maintains a distance. It reads as comic exaggeration, as the extreme version of a real thing, rather than the real thing itself. Lois's failures with Meg are quieter and closer to something recognizable. Lois is the parent who should be Meg's ally in the Griffin household. She is the more emotionally intelligent of the two parents, the one who sees what is happening around her with more clarity than Peter typically manages. And she fails Meg anyway, not through dramatic cruelty, but through the specific failure of a parent who sees a child struggling and consistently finds reasons to look somewhere else. There is an episode in season 2 called 15 Minutes of Shame that demonstrates this cleanly. Meg, embarrassed by Peter's behavior at a sleepover, gets the family onto a talk show in an attempt to address the dysfunction publicly. The result is that the Griffins become the subjects of a reality television show. Meg, the one who initiated the process, who wanted attention paid to how the family was functioning, is replaced on the show by a more conventionally attractive attractive actress. The family accepts the replacement happily. They are, in scenes that the show plays entirely for comedy, relieved to have a better version of Meg. Lois participates in this. The mother who should have said something, who should have, at minimum, registered discomfort at her daughter being literally replaced by a prettier substitute, does not say anything of consequence. The episode moves on. The selling storyline is perhaps the most extreme example of the family's treatment of Meg as something other than a full person. In one of the show's later episodes, Peter accumulates a debt at Mort Goldman's pharmacy that he cannot pay. His solution is to offer Meg to the Goldman family as a kind of indentured domestic, trading his daughter's labor and time to settle a financial obligation. Meg is not consulted. She is simply redirected, handed from one household to another, as if she were an asset rather than a person. The irony that completes the joke is that Neil Goldman, who has spent seasons pursuing Meg's affection unsuccessfully, no longer wants her once she is available. The joke lands on Meg twice, first in being sold, then in being rejected by the person who was supposedly interested in her. Running through all of this is a thread that the show visits and then retreats from over and over again, which is the suggestion that Meg's situation has done real psychological damage. Her suicidal ideation is mentioned more than once across the series, not as a crisis that the show stops to examine, but as a detail embedded in episodes that continue moving past it. Her social isolation at school is not just comedic background, it is the environment of a teenager who has received from her primary relationships the message that she is not worth full attention, and who has absorbed that message into her understanding of herself. The show knows this. It puts the knowledge into the writing periodically, allows a character to say something that acknowledges the accumulated weight of what Meg has been carrying, and then it moves on. Moving on is the show's consistent response to Meg. She is given a moment of visibility, a moment where the camera turns fully toward her and what she is experiencing is allowed to register, and then the camera turns back to Peter or Brian or Stewie, and Meg recedes again into the background of the household. This rhythm has repeated itself across enough seasons that it has become its own kind of statement, not necessarily an intentional one, about what happens to people whose pain is treated as a resource rather than a reality. There is genuine talent in Meg that the show surfaces occasionally. She is shown to be musically capable, she is academically competent. In episodes where she is allowed to simply exist without the machinery of the joke grinding against her, she demonstrates qualities of resilience and self-awareness that the other Griffin children largely do not possess. Chris is sweet but not particularly sharp. Stewie operates in a register so far from ordinary human experience that comparisons are difficult. Meg is the Griffin child who most consistently demonstrates the capacity to understand her own situation clearly, and that clarity is its own form of suffering because it means she cannot pretend she does not know what is happening to her. She knows. That is the thing the show keeps returning to and never quite fully uses. Meg Griffin knows exactly how she is treated, and exactly what it costs her, and exactly what it would mean to change it. She demonstrated this in Seahorse Seashell Party. She demonstrated it in Dial Meg for Murder. She demonstrates it in smaller ways across dozens of episodes, in moments where her expression carries something that the joke around her does not account for. The show built a character with full awareness of her own condition, and then placed her in a world that consistently refused to honor that awareness with the response it deserved. 25 years is a long time to be the lightning rod, to be the one who absorbs what nobody else wants to carry, who keeps the family's dysfunction from destroying its other relationships by agreeing over and over to be the place where the dysfunction lands. Brian called it strength. In certain lights, it could be read that way, but strength that is never rewarded, never recognized except in the moments just before it is asked for again, begins to look less like a virtue and more like an accommodation that everyone around it has learned to depend on without ever asking whether the person providing it is okay. Meg Griffin is not okay. The show has known this for most of its run. It has said so, quietly, in the episodes that allow her full visibility, and then it has moved on, and Meg has moved on with it, back to her seat at the table, back to the room nobody particularly remembers she is in, back to the position of the person who is present without being seen. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Meg's story, across 25 seasons, is the story of someone absorbing what no one else would carry. The next section arrives at the single episode where she finally put it all down, said everything she had been holding, and then quietly picked it all back up again. Section 6, The Seahorse Seashell Party, the saddest surrender on television. Season 10 of Family Guy aired in 2011 and 2012, and by that point the show had been running long enough enough that certain things about it had calcified into permanent features of the landscape. Peter would be reckless, Brian would be self-important, Stewie would scheme, and Meg would absorb. These were not plot points anymore. They were the fixed coordinates of the world, the things that were true at the beginning of every episode, regardless of what had happened in the one before. The audience had learned to expect them. The writers had learned to rely on them. And somewhere in the middle of season 10, in an episode that was nominally about a hurricane keeping the Griffin family trapped inside their house together, the show did something that almost nobody expected. It told the truth, not a partial truth, not the kind of truth that Family Guy usually allowed itself, the kind that arrives inside a joke and dissolves before it can fully land. A slow, sustained, scene-length truth delivered by the character the show had spent a decade treating as its least important resident. Meg Griffin stood in the middle of the Griffin living room during a hurricane and said everything the show had been building toward for 10 years. Every piece of damage, every specific failure, every way each member of her family had let her down. She said all of it, clearly and directly and without apology, and then she took it all back. That is the episode called Seahorse Seashell Party. That is what it does. And understanding why it matters requires sitting with both halves of it equally, because the first half, without the second, is simply a satisfying confrontation, and the second half is what turns the whole thing into something genuinely difficult to watch. A hurricane is approaching Quahog. The Griffin family is confined to the house together with no television, no distractions, and no escape from each other. The usual mechanisms the show uses to avoid sustained emotional confrontation, the cutaway, the redirect, the sudden jump to something unrelated, are unavailable. The storm has closed every exit. The family is in one room with nothing to do but be together. And what happens when they are simply together, without the noise that normally fills the space between them, is the subject of everything that follows. The early part of the episode runs the show's familiar pattern in a compressed form. Peter makes jokes at Meg's expense. Lois participates through the passive acceptance that has always been her version of complicity. The dismissal accumulates faster than usual because the setting removes the breathing room that normally paces these moments across a full episode. And Meg, at a certain point, stops absorbing. What she says is targeted and specific. To Peter, she addresses the particular quality of his failures as a father. To Lois, she speaks about what it means to have a mother who sees what is happening and consistently looks away. To Chris, she is gentler, because his failures toward her are failures of omission rather than cruelty. But she names them anyway. She does not yell. She does not perform her anger. She speaks in the tone of someone who has been organizing these thoughts for a very long time and has finally decided the moment has arrived. What happens in the room when she speaks is handled with unusual care. The family does not respond with recognition or contrition. They turn on each other. Peter, confronted with what Meg has said about him, deflects outward. Lois becomes defensive. Without Meg as their shared target, the family's dysfunction redistributes, and where it redistributes is directly into the relationships between the other members. The electricity goes somewhere else, and the somewhere else reveals something the family has never confronted. Their stability has been purchased at Meg's expense for as long as any of them can remember. Brian finds Meg after this and tells her that what she did took real strength, that standing up for herself was right, that she should be proud. And Meg listens, and then looks back at the chaos her absence from the lightning rod position has produced, and makes her decision. She goes back. She apologizes. She tells the family she is the one at fault. The family accepts this immediately, with the speed of people who have been waiting for permission to be absolved. The storm subsides. The episode ends. The ending is the whole point. It is not ironic. It is not undercut by a joke or reframed as a mistake. It is played as a quiet and considered choice made by the most clear-eyed person in the room. And Brian's framing of it as maturity and strength is the most sophisticated betrayal the episode contains. Because what he is actually doing is giving Meg a language for accepting her own exploitation as a form of dignity. He is the character who considers himself the most ethical presence in the Griffin household, and he uses that position to make it easier for Meg to return to the position that has been costing her for a decade. The discomfort that lingers after the episode ends is the correct response to it. An audience that watches Meg walk back into her position and feels only relief has missed what the episode spent its entire runtime constructing. The discomfort is the point. The ending is not a resolution. It is a depiction of something that does not resolve, that cannot resolve, because the people who would need to change in order for it to resolve are not going to change. Meg knows this. The show knows this. And Meg, with full knowledge of it, picks up what she put down and continues. That is not weakness. The show is right that it is not weakness. But it is also not the ending Meg deserved. And the distance between those two things is where the episode episode lives, in the narrow and uncomfortable space between what is true and what is fair, which are not always the same thing, and which Family Guy, at its most honest, has never pretended to be. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Meg put down everything she had been carrying, said every true thing, and then picked it all back up again because no one else would. The next section moves to a different kind of war inside the Griffin house, the one Stewie waged against his own mother for years, and what that war was actually hiding underneath all the scheming. Section 7. Stewie's war against the person who raised him. There is a scene in the very first episode of Family Guy where Stewie Griffin, an infant of approximately 1 year old, sits in a high chair at the breakfast table and delivers a monologue about his plans to destroy Lois. Not metaphorically, not in the way that frustrated children sometimes say things they do not mean in moments of anger. Literally, he has a plan. He has thought it through. He describes it with the calm precision of someone who has been working on a problem for a long time and has arrived at a solution he finds satisfying. The family around him continues eating breakfast. Nobody responds to what he has said. The scene moves on. That opening established something about Stewie that the show would spend the next 25 years complicating, revising, partially abandoning, and occasionally returning to with a clarity that made the early seasons feel newly legible. Stewie Griffin was introduced as a villain. A small one, contained in a high chair, but a genuine one, with genuine intentions. His stated goal across the first several seasons was the elimination of Lois Griffin, and he pursued that goal with an inventiveness and a commitment that the show played entirely for comedy while simultaneously taking the mechanics of it more seriously than most animated shows would have bothered to. Understanding what that war was actually about requires separating two things that the show kept deliberately tangled for most of its run. The first is the surface content of Stewie's antagonism toward Lois, the plans and the weapons and the elaborate schemes and the speeches about domination and freedom from maternal oppression. The second is what sits underneath all of that, the emotional reality that the comedy was consistently covering, the thing the war against Lois was actually expressing in the language available to a character who could not, for most of the show's run, simply say what he felt. Start with the surface, because the surface is genuinely extraordinary in its own right, and deserves to be appreciated before it is looked through. Stewie's schemes against Lois in the early seasons are among the most elaborately constructed running jokes in the show's history. He builds weapons, he lays traps, he enlists assistance from unlikely sources. He monologues about his intentions with a theatrical precision that owes more to classic villainy than to anything in the tradition of animated comedy. The voice Seth MacFarlane created for him, the clipped British accent, the formal diction, the absolute seriousness with which every plan is delivered, created a character whose comedy came entirely from the contrast between his register and his context. A baby speaking like a Bond villain plotting in a nursery. The gap between those two things was the joke, and it was a very good joke, sustained across enough seasons and enough variations to establish Stewie as one of the most recognizable comic constructions in American animated television. But the schemes never worked. This is the fact about Stewie's war against Lois that is easy to overlook because the show treats each new failure as a comedic reset rather than an accumulation. Stewie does not kill Lois. He does not come close in most episodes to killing Lois. His plans are elaborate and his commitment is genuine, and the results are, with remarkable consistency, nothing. The plans dissolve, the weapons misfire, the elaborate setups produce outcomes that have nothing to do with the original intention. Lois continues. Stewie, in the next episode, is back at the drawing board. The pattern of failure is doing more work than it first appears. A character who genuinely wanted his mother dead and was as intelligent and resourceful as Stewie is depicted to be would, over the course of 10 or 12 seasons, find a way. The intelligence is real. The resources are real. The failure is therefore a choice, not a limitation. Stewie fails to kill Lois because some part of Stewie does not actually want to kill Lois. The war is not a genuine attempt at elimination. It is something else, using the language of elimination, because the something else does not have another language available to it. What that something else is becomes clearer as the show develops and Stewie's character is allowed to expand beyond the original villain construction. By the middle seasons, the show had begun to reveal the interior of Stewie's experience in ways that the early episodes kept tightly sealed. The Road 2 episodes in particular were where this expansion happened most naturally. Removed from the Griffin house and placed in situations that required genuine collaboration with Brian, Stewie demonstrated qualities that the high chair monologues had concealed: warmth, loyalty, a capacity for genuine attachment that sat in uncomfortable contrast with the stated project of matricide. The emotional reality underneath the war against against Lois is, when it is finally visible, recognizable as something quite specific. Stewie Griffin is a child who needs his mother's attention and does not know how to ask for it in any way other than opposition. The schemes are bids for engagement. The elaborate plans are demonstrations of capability directed at an audience of one. Every trap set, every weapon constructed, every monologue delivered about the coming liberation from maternal tyranny is at some level Stewie saying, "Look at me. Look at what I can do. Look at how much effort I am expending in your direction." Lois does not see this, or does not respond to it as such, and the not seeing is its own form of the failure that runs through the Griffin household in so many directions. She responds to Stewie's antagonism with a mixture of obliviousness and the practical management of a mother who has too many things demanding her attention to fully investigate the emotional content of any single one. She loves Stewie. That much the show makes clear even in the early seasons, but she loves him in the particular way of a parent who is always managing the surface of the household rather than looking carefully underneath it. And Stewie's war, conducted on the surface with maximum visibility and theatrical flair, is somehow consistently invisible to her as what it actually is. The two-part episode Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie, which aired in season 6 in November 2007, is the closest the show ever came to taking the original premise of Stewie's war to its logical conclusion. Stewie, angry at being left behind when Peter and Lois go on a cruise, finally shoots Lois. She falls into the ocean. She is presumed dead. The episode that follows depicts Stewie taking the opportunity of Lois's apparent death to pursue the other prong of his stated ambition, world domination, while Peter is suspected of murdering his wife and brought to trial. The resolution reveals the whole thing to have been a simulation, a scenario Stewie was running in a virtual reality environment to see how the achievement of his goals would actually feel. What the simulation shows him, and what the show is arguing through this choice of structure, is that the goals themselves were never the point. World domination, achieved, feels empty. Lois dead produces not liberation, but a shape in the world that Stewie does not know how to occupy. The simulation gives him everything he said he wanted, and the experience of having it tells him something he has not been able to admit through any other means. He needs her. The war against Lois is the expression of a need so large and so unmanageable that it can only be articulated as its opposite. The child who cannot say, "I need you to pay attention to me," says, "I am going to destroy you," instead, and keeps saying it, season after season, without ever quite following through, because following through would end the only sustained form of engagement he knows how to initiate. This reading is supported by the way Stewie behaves in the episodes where Lois is genuinely present with him. When she gives him her full attention, when she is warm and engaged, and specifically responsive to him rather than managing him from a distance, the antagonism recedes. Not because Stewie has abandoned his project, but because the project's actual function has been temporarily fulfilled by other means. He is being seen. The weapon goes back in the drawer. The Brian relationship matters enormously in this context, because Brian is, for most of the show's run, the only relationship Stewie has where his need for genuine attention is consistently met. Brian sees Stewie, not the villain persona, not the comic construction, but the actual interior of the character underneath both of those things. Their friendship, developed across years of Road 2 episodes and smaller shared moments, is the one place in the Griffin household where Stewie does not have to conduct a war to be noticed. Brian's presence is what makes the war against Lois sustainable, because it means Stewie has somewhere to put the need for connection when the war fails to satisfy it, which it always does. The evolution of Stewie's character across the show's later seasons moved him away from the original matricide project in ways that were sometimes handled gracefully, and sometimes simply dropped without acknowledgement. By the middle seasons, the elaborate plans against Lois had become less frequent, replaced by a broader range of storylines that used Stewie's intelligence and his particular voice in different directions. The villainy became more occasional, more situational, less the defining feature of the character, and more one register among several that the show could access depending on what a given episode required. This evolution is the right creative choice, but it created a continuity problem that the show never fully resolved. The early Stewie, the one with a specific and sustained project of eliminating his mother, and the later Stewie, the one whose emotional life centers on his friendship with Brian, and whose relationship with Lois has softened into something closer to ordinary family dynamics, are not seamlessly connected. The show did not take the time to document how the transition happened. It simply began writing Stewie differently, and trusted the audience to update their understanding without being given the materials for the update. What remains consistent across both versions of the character is the underlying emotional structure. Early Stewie channels his need for recognition and connection into opposition. Later, Stewie channels it into the Brian friendship and into the various creative and intellectual projects the show gives him across the later seasons. The content changes, the need does not. Stewie Griffin is, from the first episode to the most recent, a character whose primary emotional project is finding ways to be seen by people who are, for various reasons, not fully looking. Lois is the most important of those people, and the war against her is the most sustained expression of what it costs Stewie that she is not fully looking. The war is dramatic and comic and elaborately constructed, and also, underneath all of that, quite simple. It is a child who wants his mother to pay attention, using the only vocabulary available to him in the world the show has built, which is the vocabulary of schemes and weapons and theatrical villainy, because the direct vocabulary of need is not something the character was originally constructed to use. The show understood this at its best moments. The simulation structure of Stewie Kills Lois understood it. The way Brian and Stewie's relationship was written in the Better Road to episodes understood it. The grief of life of Brian, which was examined in an earlier section, understood it in perhaps the most direct terms the show ever managed, because losing Brian was losing the one relationship where Stewie did not have to conduct a war to be known. What the war against Lois represents, when all of its theatrical content is set aside and the emotional structure underneath is examined directly, is one of the show's most honest depictions of how need expresses itself when it cannot find its direct form. Children who do not receive the specific quality of attention they require do not simply stop needing it. They find other ways to demand it, ways that are often indirect and sometimes destructive, and almost always misread by the people they are directed at. Stewie's schemes are misread by Lois as comedy or as the manageable eccentricity of a strange child, when what they actually are is a sustained and desperate argument for her full attention. She never quite gives it. The war never quite ends. And Stewie, season after season, goes back to the drawing board with his weapons and his plans and his British accent and his theatrical conviction, conducting a war whose real purpose he cannot name and whose real target is not destruction, but something almost its opposite. He just wants her to look. The schemes are how he asks. The failures are how the show admits, quietly and without ever quite saying so directly, that the asking has not been answered in the form it actually needed. And Lois, who loves her son in her way, who manages the household and keeps the family moving, and absorbs the chaos of living with Peter while also raising 3 children, one of whom is a genius with a considerable weapons inventory, continues not to see what is in front of her, which is not so different in its quiet way from what happens to Meg, or to Lois herself in her marriage to Peter. The Griffin household is full of people who need things from each other that they cannot say directly, and who spend enormous energy finding indirect ways to demand what a single honest conversation might have provided. The indirection is the comedy. The need underneath it is the part that stays with the viewer long after the joke has moved on. Stewie Griffin pointed a ray gun at his mother for 10 years and never pulled the trigger. The show asked the audience to find that funny, and the audience did, and neither the audience nor the show fully stopped to ask what a child who builds weapons against the person responsible for his care is actually trying to say. The answer, when it is finally visible, is heartbreaking in its simplicity. He is trying to say that he is there, that he is present, that he exists in the room and would like to be known by the person in it who matters most to him. That is all the war was ever about. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Stewie's war against Lois was never really about destruction. It was about being seen by the one person who kept looking somewhere else. The next section moves outside the Griffin house to the bar down the street, where 4 men called each other friends for 25 years, and the record of what that friendship actually looked like deserves a long and careful look. Section 8. Friends who were never really friends. Peter, Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland. The Drunken Clam is a bar in Quahog, Rhode Island, and for 25 years it has been the place where 4 men go to be with each other at the end of the day. Peter Griffin, Joe Swanson, Glenn Quagmire, and Cleveland Brown have occupied the same stools, ordered the same drinks, and called each other their closest friends across hundreds of episodes of Family Guy. The bar itself is unremarkable. Dark wood, low lighting, the kind of place that exists in every mid-sized American town, and that means something specific to the people who have made it their regular spot. A place that says, this is where we belong, and these are our people. The question that the show has circled without quite landing on across its entire run is what the friendship between these four men actually consists of when it is examined closely. Not what they call it, not the label they apply to it, or the warmth they occasionally demonstrate in each other's company, but the substance of it. What Peter, Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland have actually done for and to each other across 25 seasons of shared history. Because the record of that history, when it is laid out carefully, tells a story about male friendship that is considerably more complicated and considerably more honest than the comfortable image of four regulars at their favorite bar would suggest. Start with the nature of the group itself, because the composition matters. Peter is the center, not because he is the most admirable or the most interesting of the four, but because he is the loudest and the most consistently in motion, and the group has organized itself around his energy in a way that has never really been examined or chosen by its members. It simply happened. Peter generates situations. The others respond to those situations. The friendship is, in its structural reality, less a gathering of equals than an orbit, three people circling the gravitational pull of someone whose needs and impulses and complete disregard for consequences continuously determines where everyone ends up. Joe Swanson is a police officer and a paraplegic, and the show has done interesting things with both of those facts across its run, without always being entirely thoughtful about either of them. His disability is treated inconsistently, sometimes as a source of genuine character depth, and sometimes simply as a comic device that the show pulls out when a joke requires it and sets aside when it does not. His friendship with Peter follows a similar pattern. Joe is the most stable of the four in terms of his values and his professional identity. He has a functional marriage, a job he takes seriously, and a basic moral orientation that the other three members of the group largely do not share. And the show uses these qualities not to make Joe the group's conscience, but to make him the group's straight man, the character whose relative normality provides a backdrop against which the chaos of the others can be measured. What Joe actually receives from the friendship is harder to identify than what he gives to it. He provides a car, frequently. He provides his professional connections, his law enforcement access, his willingness to use his official position to extricate the group from situations that Peter has created. He absorbs Peter's chaos with a patience that, across enough episodes, starts to look less like genuine tolerance and more like someone who has made peace with being used because the alternative is a loneliness he finds harder to manage than the using. The show touches this occasionally, in episodes that give Joe a moment of recognition that his friends are not always treating him well, and then the moment passes and he is back at the bar and the cycle continues. Quagmire is the most complex member of the group, and the one whose presence creates the most friction in any honest examination of the friendship's dynamics. Glenn Quagmire is a pilot and a sexual predator. The show has treated these two facts with radically different levels of seriousness across its run. The predatory behavior has been one of the show's longest-running comedic threads, a running joke that the show revisited season after season without ever fully committing to examining what it meant that this was a person Peter considered a close friend and brought into his home. The giggity catchphrase became one of the show's most recognizable signatures. The behavior it represented was treated as a quirk rather than a pattern with real targets. There are episodes where the show pulls back and looks at Quagmire's behavior with something approaching genuine discomfort. The season 9 episode, Quagmire's Dad, in which Quagmire's father reveals that he is a transgender woman, handles its central subject with more care than might have been expected from Family Guy in 2011, though the execution was not without its problems. More relevant to the friendship dynamic is the way that episode positions Quagmire's relationship with the group during a moment of personal vulnerability. He brings his father, then still presenting as a male military figure, to meet his friends, and the pride and nervousness in that introduction says something about what the group means to him that the comedic episodes do not. He wants them to approve of something that matters to him. He is, for once, not performing for them, but actually showing them something real. The group's response is mixed. Brian's reaction, in particular, is the one that generates the most drama in the episode, but the broader dynamic of the group around Quagmire in a moment of genuine exposure is instructive. The friendship is more comfortable with Quagmire the performer than with Quagmire the person who needs something. The same could be said of almost every member of the group in relation to all of the others. The friendship operates smoothly when everyone is playing their assigned role. It becomes uncertain when someone steps outside that role and reveals a need that the group has not been organized to address. Cleveland Brown is a gentler and in many ways sadder case. Cleveland was a member of the original group from the show's earliest seasons, and his presence in the dynamic was defined largely by his contrast with Peter. He was quieter, more considered, more emotionally accessible than the other men in the group, quicker to express genuine feeling, and slower to default to the kind of reflexive insensitivity that Peter deployed constantly. His marriage to Loretta, which ended in infidelity and divorce in the show's 7th season, was one of the more genuinely painful storylines the show produced in that period, and the group's response to it revealed something about the friendship's actual capacity for sustained emotional support. Peter's response to Cleveland's marital collapse was enthusiastic involvement that somehow managed to be almost entirely about Peter. The advice was bad. The interventions were counterproductive. The emotional support that Cleveland actually needed, the kind that involves someone sitting with you in your difficulty without trying to fix it or redirect it or make it into a story about themselves, was not what the group provided. They provided noise. They provided activity. They provided the specific kind of male friendship that is very good at filling silence with distraction and very poor at creating the conditions in which someone can actually say what they are going through. Cleveland eventually left Quahog for a spin-off series, The Cleveland Show, which ran from 2009 to 2013. The departure was handled within the world of Family Guy as a move to Virginia to reconnect with a childhood friend. But the departure itself, the creative decision to give Cleveland his own show and remove him from the group, was the show acknowledging something that had been building for years, which was that Cleveland's particular qualities, his warmth, his emotional accessibility, his fundamental decency, did not have enough space in the dynamic of the Quahog group to fully express themselves. The group was organized around Peter's energy, and Peter's energy did not leave room for the kind of character Cleveland was. When Cleveland returned to Quahog after the Cleveland show ended, he slotted back into the group with a smoothness that the show treated as a homecoming, and that could also be read as a depiction of how little the group had actually changed in his absence. The same dynamics, the same bar, the same stools. Cleveland back in his position, the friendship resuming its familiar pattern. And no real examination of what leaving had meant or what returning required. The Quagmire and Brian dynamic deserves its own careful attention because it is the most explicitly antagonistic relationship in the extended friend group, and also the one that comes closest to saying directly what the show usually leaves implicit. Quagmire's dislike of Brian is one of the more sustained character threads in the later seasons, culminating in the Jerome is the new black monologue that was referenced in the Brian section. What is interesting about the Quagmire and Brian conflict in the context of the broader friendship group is that it exists almost entirely outside of Peter's awareness. Peter considers both Quagmire and Brian his close friends. He is, in most episodes, either oblivious to the tension between them or unwilling to engage with it. The conflict is happening in the group, and Peter, the group's nominal center, is not available to it. That unavailability is characteristic. Peter's friendship with each of the other men is real in its way, but it is real on Peter's terms, which means it is real in the ways that cost Peter nothing and become uncertain in the ways that would require him to be present and attentive outside his own comfort zone. He is a good time. He is reliably there at the bar. He will join an adventure, create a scheme, generate an experience. He is a terrible person to bring a serious problem to, not because he does not care, but because his capacity for the kind of sustained, attentive care that serious problems require is genuinely limited, and he has never been asked to develop it because the group has organized itself around his limitations rather than challenging them. Joe is the one who most consistently gets the short end of this arrangement. There is a category of Family Guy episode in which Joe's disability becomes the center of a storyline, and these episodes have a pattern that is worth naming. Joe's physical situation generates a problem, or a crisis, or an opportunity. The group responds with varying degrees of helpfulness and unhelpfulness. The episode resolves, and the resolution almost always returns Joe to the same position he occupied before the episode began, which is the position of the group member whose particular circumstances are periodically foregrounded for an episode's worth of attention and then filed back into the background. The show gives Joe visibility in episodes about Joe, and then reduces him to the reliable straight man in the episodes about everyone else. There is an episode called Peter's Two Dads from season 5 that demonstrates the friendship's actual texture with unusual clarity. The episode is primarily about Peter discovering that his biological father may be someone other than the man who raised him, but the friendship scenes surrounding the main plot show the group in its characteristic mode. They are present. They are engaged with Peter's situation. They provide the warmth and the humor and the companionship that the friendship genuinely does contain. And they do not at any point ask Peter anything that would require him to go somewhere uncomfortable. The support is real, and it is also perfectly calibrated to require nothing of Peter that he is not already equipped to give. This is what the friendship is. This is what it has always been. It is a very good friendship for people who do not need much from it. It becomes inadequate the moment someone in it actually does need something. The Cleveland and Loretta infidelity storyline tested this more directly than most. Cleveland needed his friends during that period in a way that was specific and sustained and not resolvable through a single bar conversation or a comedic adventure that distracted from the underlying pain. The group provided the adventure. It provided the distraction. It provided everything it knew how to provide, which was not what Cleveland needed and was probably better than nothing. But the gap between what was provided and what was actually needed is visible in the episodes if the right attention is paid. Quagmire's relationship with the group contains its own version of this gap. His behavior, the predatory behavior that the show treats as comedy, is never challenged by the group in any sustained way. Peter knows about it. Joe, a police officer, knows about it. Cleveland, whose decency is one of his defining qualities, knows about it. And none of them have ever made the challenge of it a condition of the friendship. The friendship continues. The behavior continues. The gap between what the group's members believe about themselves as friends and what they actually provide to each other as such continues. What Family Guy has built with this group across 25 seasons, whether entirely intentionally or not, is a portrait of a particular kind of male friendship that is very common and very rarely examined honestly in popular culture. It is the friendship of people who have been showing up in the same place for so long that the showing up has become its own form of loyalty, independent of what actually happens between them when they are there. It is the friendship of people who would describe each other as their closest friends and who mean it sincerely, while also never quite managing to be available to each other in the ways that closest friends are supposed to be available. It is the friendship that looks from the outside and feels from the inside like the real thing, and that is the real thing in many of its dimensions, and that is also genuinely inadequate in ways that none of its members have the tools or the inclination to name. Peter betrays this group constantly through his carelessness and his self-absorption, and the group absorbs his betrayals the way Meg absorbs the family's dysfunction, because the alternative is a disruption to an arrangement that, for all its costs, is the closest thing each of them has to a place where they belong. Quagmire betrays the group's implicit moral standards through behavior that none of them are willing to challenge, and the unwillingness to challenge it is its own form of participation. Joe gives more than he receives and has apparently decided that the giving is worth the cost. Cleveland stayed for years in a dynamic that did not have enough space for who he actually was, and then left, and then came back. And the coming back is its own kind of statement about how few alternatives there are when the place you belong is also the place that consistently fails to see you fully. The drunken clam is still there. The stools are still occupied. The drinks are still ordered. Four men who have known each other for more than 2 decades sit in their familiar places and call each other their people. And in the important sense, they are correct. These are their people. The people who will show up. The people who will be there. The people who will join the adventure and fill the silence and make the ordinary business of getting through a week feel less solitary than it would otherwise be. That is not nothing. The show has always understood that it is not nothing. The warmth in those bar scenes is real, and dismissing it entirely would miss what the show is actually depicting, which is not a false friendship, but an incomplete one. A friendship that contains genuine affection and genuine loyalty of a certain kind, and genuine pleasure in each other's company. And that also contains all the gaps and silences and unaddressed needs and unspoken costs that accumulate when people care about each other without ever quite learning how to care for each other. The difference between caring about someone and caring for them is the quiet subject of every bar scene the show has ever set in The Drunken Clam. The 4 men on those stools care about each other in the first sense, without difficulty, and in the second sense, without much success. And 25 years of showing up to the same bar is both a testament to the first kind of caring and a very long record of the limits of what the first kind, on its own, can actually provide. They are there every week. They are reliably, genuinely there. And the being there is real, and the limits of what the being there can do are also real. And Family Guy has spent 25 seasons sitting with both of those truths at the same time, without forcing a resolution between them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Drunken Clam held 4 men who showed up for each other in every way except the ways that mattered most. The next section steps back from the characters entirely and looks at the show itself, at the decisions the writers made that betrayed the very people the audience had learned to care about. Section 9, The biggest gut punch, when the show betrayed its own characters. There is a particular kind of disappointment that arrives when a piece of storytelling turns against the people inside it. Not the disappointment of a bad episode, or a joke that does not land, or a season that loses its footing for a stretch before finding it again. Something more specific than any of those things. The disappointment of realizing that the people who built a world and populated it with characters the audience came to care about have made decisions about those characters that serve something other than the characters themselves. That the writing room has looked at what it built and decided that its usefulness as a tool outweighs its integrity as a person, even a fictional one. Family Guy has done this more than once across its run. Not accidentally, not as a byproduct of the difficulties of sustaining a long-running animated comedy, but as a deliberate creative choice made in full awareness of what it was doing and what it would cost. The show has, on several occasions, looked directly at its own characters and decided to spend them, to use what the audience felt about them in service of something that had nothing to do with honoring what those characters had become. The most discussed instance of this is Brian's death in season 12, which has already been examined in its own section. But the full picture of how the show betrayed its own characters is larger than that single event, and it requires looking at 3 separate but connected decisions the writing room made across the show's run that each represented a version of the same choice. The choice to prioritize the show's needs over the character's integrity, the choice to use the audience's emotional investment as a resource without fully acknowledging the cost of that use, and the choice, perhaps the most damaging of all, to build something real and then treat it as expendable. Begin with Meg, because Meg is the longest running and most sustained example of the show making a choice about a character that the character did not deserve. The decision to make Meg the family's designated target was not a single moment. It was a gradual solidification that happened across the first several seasons, as the writers discovered that Meg as punching bag generated reliable laughs and required less creative investment than Meg as full character would have demanded. In the very first season, Meg had storylines that treated her inner life with some degree of seriousness. She had social ambitions and romantic hopes, and the particular texture of a teenager navigating a world that was not organized around her comfort. She was not fully realized, but she was pointed in the direction of being something more than a target. Somewhere in the transition between the original run and the revival, that direction was abandoned. The revival era Family Guy, which began in 2005, had made certain determinations about what the show was and what each character's function within it would be. Meg's function was decided with a clarity that left very little room for the kind of development that would have complicated it. She would be the one everyone dismissed. She would absorb the joke. She would be the release valve for the show's most pointed cruelties. The character whose mistreatment could be played for comedy because the show had established and the audience had accepted that she was the appropriate recipient of it. The mechanism by which this decision was normalized is worth examining carefully. It worked because the show was consistent. Consistency in comedy creates expectation, and expectation creates permission. After enough seasons of Peter dismissing Meg and the laugh track affirming the dismissal stopped requiring justification. It was simply what happened. The audience absorbed it as part of the show's texture, rather than as a choice the writers were making episode by episode. The cruelty became invisible through repetition, which is precisely how certain kinds of real-world cruelty sustain themselves, and the show, whether consciously or not, was depicting that mechanism while also participating in it. What makes this a betrayal, rather than simply a creative decision, is what the show knew about Meg and chose not to fully use. Seahorse Seashell Party demonstrated that the writers understood exactly what had been done to this character and what it had cost her. The monologue Meg delivers in that episode is not the work of a writing room that has been treating her as a target out of ignorance. It is the work of people who knew what they were sitting on and decided, after giving it a single episode's worth of full visibility, to put it back in the drawer. They had the tools to make Meg's story one of the most genuinely moving threads in the show's entire run. They chose not to use those tools. They chose the laugh, the reset, the return to the established dynamic, because the established dynamic was easier and more reliable and did not require the kind of sustained creative investment that genuine character development demands. That is the betrayal. Not that Meg was mistreated within the fiction, because fictional characters are mistreated all the time, and the mistreatment can serve the story. The betrayal is that the show understood what it had built with her and decided that the function she served was more valuable than the person she was. It spent her. It used her emotional truth as the engine for a single memorable episode, and then folded that truth back into the comedy machinery and kept running. The Peter Griffin degradation is a different kind of betrayal, and in some ways a quieter one, which is why it is less discussed than the Meg situation or the Brian death. Peter Griffin in the early seasons is a specific and carefully constructed comic character. He is selfish and impulsive and not particularly intelligent, but underneath the selfishness and the impulsiveness, there is something that functions like love for his family, something that produces moments of genuine warmth between the comedy, moments where the audience can see why Lois married him and why his children, despite everything, are attached to him. The early Peter is a recognizable human type, the lovable disaster, the man whose intentions are better than his execution, and whose failures come from limitation rather than from indifference. The later Peter, particularly from the middle seasons onward, is something different. The shift is gradual enough that it is hard to identify a single episode where it happened, but across the seasons, the warmth that grounded the early Peter in something human became less consistent and eventually became unreliable. Episodes appeared in which Peter's behavior toward Lois, toward Meg, toward his friends, crossed lines that the earlier version of the character would not have crossed. Not because the writing was trying to say something new about who Peter was becoming, but because the writers needed a more extreme version of his behavior to generate the level of comic energy that the show's format demanded as the seasons accumulated. The character was pushed further out because further out was funnier. And the cost of that push, the erosion of the human core that had made the original character worth caring about, was not fully accounted for. By the later seasons, Peter Griffin had become capable of things that the season 1 or season 2 Peter would not have been recognizable in. Not as growth, not as deterioration that the show was depicting with awareness, simply as the consequence of a writing room that kept reaching for the most extreme version of the character without tracking what was being lost in the reaching. The audience noticed this, though they did not always have the vocabulary to name it precisely. The complaints about later season Peter being less likable, less funny, somehow harder to root for, are not complaints about the character becoming more complex. They are complaints about a character being used up, its original humanity depleted through the process of being the engine of an enormous and long-running comedic enterprise. The Brian death and resurrection sequence, which has been discussed in the context of what Stewie lost, deserves to be re-examined here from a different angle, specifically from the angle of what the writing room was doing when it made that decision, and what that decision reveals about how the show understood its own characters by season 12. Killing Brian was a creative choice made by Seth MacFarlane's own subsequent admission, with full awareness that it would generate significant audience reaction. The team knew Brian was beloved. They knew his death would be felt. They used that knowledge to generate exactly the reaction they anticipated, a wave of genuine grief and anger that translated into the kind of cultural attention that a show in its 12th season rarely manages to produce. The resurrection 3 episodes later, accomplished through the time travel mechanic that had been set up in the same episode where Stewie destroyed his machine, was presented at the time as a genuine creative choice rather than a planned reversal. MacFarlane and the writing room maintained, in the immediate aftermath of Brian's death, a degree of ambiguity about whether the character was truly gone. The ambiguity was itself a tool. It extended the period of audience grief and attention beyond what a clearly temporary death would have sustained. People who might have suspected a reversal were kept uncertain enough to remain emotionally engaged. The grief was extended, the attention was held. And then Brian came back, and the show continued, and the whole sequence was revealed to be, in its essential structure, a manipulation of the audience's emotional investment for the purpose of generating cultural buzz during a season that might otherwise have passed without significant notice. This assessment sounds harsh, and it is worth pausing to be fair about what else was true of that sequence. The episodes themselves, Life of Brian and Christmas Guy, contain genuine emotional craft. The grief Stewie experiences is written and performed with real feeling. The reunion is handled with the restraint and tenderness that was noted in the earlier section. The individual episodes are not cynical in their execution, even if the decision to create and then reverse the death carries a strategic quality that sits uneasily alongside the genuine emotion in the writing. Both things are true simultaneously. The show made something real and used it as a marketing instrument at the same time, and the coexistence of those two facts is the most honest description of what happened. What the Brian sequence revealed, more than anything else, was the show's understanding of its own audience as a resource. The grief was real. The show knew it would be real because it had spent years, through the Brian and Stewie relationship in particular, building the conditions for that grief. It had made the investment, cultivated the emotional attachment, and then harvested it. The harvest was not only cynical, because the thing harvested was also genuinely good television in the episodes themselves, but the harvesting was visible, and its visibility changed something in the relationship between the show and at least a portion of its audience who understood what had happened. The writing room's treatment of certain other characters across the run follows a similar pattern at a lower intensity. Quagmire's predatory predatory behavior, which has been discussed, represents a decision to protect a comedic asset at the cost of the show's moral coherence. The behavior generated reliable laughs across many seasons. Addressing it seriously, allowing it to have the consequences that the show's nominal moral framework would require, would have disrupted a reliable source of comedy. The show chose the comedy. The choice was made repeatedly and consistently enough that it constitutes a policy rather than an oversight, a decision that the behavior and the character who exhibited it were more valuable as they were than they would be if held to the standards the show occasionally applied to other things. Joe Swanson's disability is handled across the show's run with an inconsistency that reveals a similar calculus. When the inconsistency is useful for a joke, Joe can do things that his condition would prevent. When the condition is useful for a storyline, it is foregrounded with something approaching sensitivity. The character's physical reality is treated as a dial that the writing room can turn up or down depending on what a given episode requires. And the person inside that reality is served by this arrangement only when the arrangement happens to align with what would serve him. The rest of the time, Joe's integrity as a character is subordinated to the episode's needs without the show registering this as a cost. Cleveland's departure for his own spin-off is the most structurally significant instance of the show doing something to a character that the character's presence in the group had not prepared for. Cleveland Brown, as he had been written inside Family Guy, was a gentle and emotionally accessible man whose qualities were consistently underused by the dynamic of the Quahog group. The Cleveland Show was an attempt to give those qualities more space, to build a world organized around Cleveland's particular kind of warmth rather than around Peter's energy. The attempt produced a show that ran for 4 seasons before being canceled. When Cleveland returned to Family Guy, he returned to the same position he had occupied before leaving. The same bar, the same stool, the same role in the group's dynamic. The spin-off had happened and then unhappened. The character had been given a window and then returned to the room. What the return said, whether the show intended it to say this or not, was that Cleveland's particular qualities were not sufficient to anchor their own world and were not transformative enough to change the world he returned to. He came back, and the group absorbed him and continued. The continuity was the point, for the show's purposes. For Cleveland as a character, the continuity was a kind of verdict. He had been given the opportunity to exist in a different configuration, and the configuration had not sustained itself. And now, he was back where the show had always known he would be, in his place at the bar, in his role in the group, in the position that the show's structure required him to occupy, regardless of whether it was the position that served him best. Across all of these instances, the pattern is the same. The show built something real, whether a character's humanity or a relationship's depth or a dynamic's emotional weight, and then made decisions about that real thing that prioritized the show's operational needs over the thing's integrity. The decisions were not always wrong in their outcomes. Some of the episodes that resulted from them are among the show's best, but the decisions were consistently made from a position of treating the characters as instruments rather than as the ends of the enterprise, as means to the show's continuation rather than as the reason the show was worth continuing. This is not unique to Family Guy. Long-running television, animated or otherwise, faces the structural problem that the characters it creates become both the show's most valuable asset and its most significant constraint. A character who develops authentically across many seasons eventually becomes someone who cannot do everything the show needs a character to do. The authenticity limits the utility. The writing room, facing this constraint, makes choices about which takes priority, and the choices reveal what the show actually values when the pressure is on. Family Guy's choices, across 25 seasons, have consistently revealed a show that values its own continuation and its own comedic machinery over the integrity of the characters that machinery runs on. This is not a damning verdict, because the show has also produced, within the context of those choices, moments of genuine emotional honesty and genuine creative courage that could not have existed without the long run that required those choices. The two things are connected. The betrayals are part of what made the real moments possible, because a show that had always honored its characters' integrity completely would not have taken the risks that produced its best work. But the characters paid for those risks. Meg paid, Brian paid, and was restored, and the restoration was itself a kind of payment. Peter paid the cost of being pushed beyond his original humanity in the service of escalating comedy. Cleveland paid the cost of being a character whose particular qualities the show's structure could not fully accommodate. Joe paid the cost of being reliable in ways the show depended on without reciprocating. Quagmire paid, in a different direction, the cost of being protected from consequences that his behavior had genuinely earned. The audience paid too, in the specific currency of realizing, at various various points across the show's run that the emotional investment they had made in these characters was understood by the people who wrote them as a resource to be managed rather than a trust to be honored. That realization does not erase the investment. The feelings were real. The characters, at their best, earned them. But the realization changes the texture of the relationship between the show and the audience who has followed it across 25 years. It introduces a wariness that was not present in the earlier seasons, a background awareness that the show is capable of spending what the audience has built up in caring about these people, and that the spending can happen at any time in service of any goal the writing room determines is worth the cost. That wariness is itself a kind of Betrayal's legacy. It lives in the audience's relationship to the show long after the specific episodes that produced it have been absorbed and processed. It is the reason that certain Family Guy moments land differently for longtime viewers than they do for people who came to the show later. Why the emotional beats that would be straightforwardly moving for a newer audience carry a faint undercurrent of caution for someone who has watched long enough to know what the show is capable of doing with the feelings it generates. The show built something worth caring about. It also spent that something repeatedly and with clear awareness of what it was doing. The spending produced both harm and, occasionally, genuine art. Both of those outcomes are real, and the full picture of what Family Guy has been across its run requires holding both of them at the same time, the way the show itself has always held its best impulses and its worst choices in the same frame, without resolving the tension between them into something cleaner or simpler than the truth. The truth is that the show loved its characters in the way that long-running enterprises love their most valuable assets, carefully, strategically, with one eye always on what they could provide and one eye on the bottom of what they had left to give. That is not quite the same as the love the characters deserved, but it is what they got. And across 25 years of episodes, they made something out of it anyway, in the spaces between the betrayals, in the moments when the show forgot to be strategic and simply told the truth. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The show spent its characters, used their humanity as fuel, and occasionally produced something extraordinary in the burning. The final section steps back from all of it and asks the question that has been underneath every section of this video. What does it mean that millions of people still return to this world every night? And what does that returning actually say? Section 10. What Family Guy was really saying all along. There is something that happens when a person puts on Family Guy late at night. Not in the afternoon, not as background noise during a busy day, but specifically late at night, when the day is finished and the room is quiet, and the particular kind of tiredness that comes from being a person in the world has settled in. The show comes on, and something in the body relaxes. Not because what is on the screen is peaceful, because it is not peaceful. Peter is probably doing something that will cost someone else considerably. A cutaway is probably happening that has nothing to do with anything. Someone in the Griffin household is probably absorbing something they should not have to absorb. None of this is peaceful. And yet, the person watching relaxes, and often falls asleep, and wakes up sometime later to find another episode playing, and does not turn it off. This is a real phenomenon. It is not incidental to what Family Guy is. It is one of the most significant things about the show, and it has never been fully explained by the standard accounts of why the show works. The standard accounts focus on the jokes, the cultural references, the shock value, the cutaway structure, the voice performances, the particular chemistry of the cast of characters. All of these things are real, and all of them contribute to what the show is. None of them fully explain why a show about a family that consistently fails each other, set in a world where loyalty is conditional and love is expressed primarily through absence, has become one of the most reliable sleep companions in the history of American television. The explanation, when it is finally arrived at, has less to do with the comedy than with the truth underneath the comedy. And arriving at that explanation requires stepping back from every specific betrayal that has been examined across this video and looking at the whole shape of what the show has been building for 25 years. Family Guy is, at its foundation, a show about people who keep coming back. That is the thing that all of the betrayals, all of the failures, all of the moments of neglect and cruelty and self-absorption and strategic manipulation that have been cataloged across these sections have in common. After every one of them, the people involved come back. Peter does something that costs Lois something real, and Lois comes back to the marriage. Brian fails Stewie in ways that should test the friendship beyond recovery, and the friendship recovers. Meg absorbs what the family deposits with her and returns to the table for the next meal. The four men at the Drunken Clam are hurt by each other, and convenient to each other, and use each other, and disappoint each other, and show up again the following week on the same stools. The coming back is the constant. The betrayals are the weather inside the constant. That structure is recognizable material in a way that transcends the specific content of any individual episode. People who have watched Family Guy for years, who have grown up with it or discovered it in adulthood or returned to it after periods away, are not returning to it because they find the Griffin household admirable. They are returning to it because they recognize it. The specific shape of the dysfunction, the way love and failure coexist in the same house without either canceling the other, the way people who hurt each other keep showing up for each other anyway, the way the ordinary business of being a family or a group of friends contains both genuine warmth and genuine damage and does not resolve that contradiction into something cleaner than the truth. These are recognizable things. They are the texture of a great many real lives. And Family Guy, for all its absurdity and its cutaway gags and its willingness to push into territory that other shows would not enter, has always been depicting them with a consistency and a precision that its surface presentation does not immediately suggest. The show premiered in 1999, and the people who were teenagers or young adults when it first aired are now in their 30s and 40s. They watched the early seasons at a point in their lives when the Griffin household was funny in a straightforward way, when Peter's failures were comic rather than recognizable, when Meg's situation read as an exaggerated joke rather than something with a more uncomfortable relationship to real experience. They grew up, the show kept running, and somewhere along the way, for many of those viewers, the relationship to the material shifted. The comedy was still there, but underneath it, something else had become visible that had not been visible before, or that had been visible in a different way, which is the portrait of people managing the gap between what they hoped their relationships would be and what those relationships actually are. That shift in how the material reads across a lifetime of watching is one of the stranger and more interesting things about long-running television. The show does not change. The episodes from season 3 are the same episodes they were when they aired in 2001, but the viewer changes, and the change in the viewer changes what the show is doing in a given moment, what lands and what passes by, what feels like a joke and what feels like something that the joke is covering. A person watching the Seahorse Seashell Party episode at 16 receives something different from the same episode watched at 34. Not because the episode is different, but because the experience of being a person who has navigated a family, who has been the one absorbing things or the one whose carelessness cost someone else, is different at those two ages in ways that make the episode's material land in different places. Family Guy understood this at some level from relatively early in its run. The show was always aware of its multi-generational audience, always conscious of the fact that it was being watched simultaneously by people at very different stages of life and very different relationships to the material it was depicting. The cutaway structure was partly a response to this awareness. By interrupting the emotional content with comedy before it could fully register, the show was managing the experience of different audiences simultaneously. The younger viewer got the joke. The older viewer got the joke and also got what the joke was covering. Both viewers were served by the same moment. The cutaway was an inclusivity mechanism as much as it was a comedic one. What the show was really saying, underneath the cutaways and the laugh track and the decades of dysfunction, can be assembled from the evidence of the preceding sections into something coherent. It was saying that love between people who are not perfectly equipped to love each other looks like a very specific mixture of genuine warmth and genuine damage, and that this mixture is not a failure of love, but simply what love looks like in most of the houses where it actually lives. It was saying that the people who absorb the most in a family or a friendship are often the strongest rather than the weakest, but that strength of this kind carries a cost that the people benefiting from it almost never fully account for. It was saying that the gap between who people present themselves as and who they actually are in the moments that cost them something is where the most interesting and the most honest version of any character lives. And it was saying all of these things inside a comedy format that gave the audience permission to laugh at them, which is possibly the only format that would have allowed them to be said at all. The laugh is a very specific and undervalued mechanism. It creates distance from content that would otherwise be too close for comfort. A person watching Peter dismiss Meg can laugh at the joke and feel simultaneously something uncomfortable about the joke that the laugh helps them manage. The discomfort does not disappear because the laugh happened. It is processed through the laugh, absorbed into the experience of watching in a way that is different from how it would be absorbed if it arrived without the comedic frame. Comedy Comedy about real and painful things does not trivialize those things. At its best, it creates the conditions under which those things can be felt by people who might not otherwise be able to approach them directly. Family Guy has been doing this for 25 years. It has been creating, inside the frame of an often crude and frequently chaotic animated comedy, the conditions under which a certain kind of truth about family and friendship and the ordinary maintenance of human relationships could be felt by an audience that might not have been able to approach it directly in a different format. The Meg episodes that allowed her full humanity were not anomalies. They were the show briefly making its underlying project visible. The Brian and Stewie relationship was not a departure from the show's essential nature. It was the show's essential nature made legible through the most carefully developed relationship in the story. The sleep phenomenon, the thing that was named at the beginning of this section, is connected to all of this in a way that is worth trying to articulate precisely. People fall asleep to Family Guy not despite the dysfunction, but partly because of it. The dysfunction is familiar. The coming back from the dysfunction is familiar. The rhythm of failure and recovery and failure again and recovery again is the rhythm of a great many real lives. And there is something in hearing that rhythm played back that is both unsettling and, in its strange way, comforting. It confirms something. It says, this is how things are, and people endure it, and they keep showing up, and the house is still standing in the next episode. That confirmation, delivered inside a comedy that keeps the full weight of it at a manageable distance through laughter, produces a specific quality of relaxation that is not quite comfort and not quite catharsis, but something in the middle, something that makes the body settle and the mind quiet and sleep possible in a way that a genuinely peaceful show does not always manage. A genuinely peaceful show requires a kind of suspension of disbelief about how things actually are that a tired person may not have the energy to maintain. Family Guy does not ask for that suspension. It meets the viewer where they are, in the messy reality of how people actually treat each other, and it plays that reality back with comedy and warmth and occasional genuine devastation. And it keeps going, and the going keeps going, and the constancy of it is what the tired person needs at the end of a day of being in a world that is also messy and also keeps going regardless. Peter Griffin will fail Lois in the next episode. Lois will absorb it and find her way back. Meg will be dismissed and will absorb that too, and will return to the table. Brian will do something that does not match the image he has of himself and will not fully reckon with the gap. Stewie will conduct some version of his war, and it will not achieve what the war has always actually been seeking. The four men at the Drunken Clam will sit on their stools and talk and drink and fail each other in the specific ways they have always failed each other, and show up again the following week. All of this will happen. All of it has happened hundreds of times before, and the viewer on the couch at midnight, whose own life contains its own versions of all these patterns, will watch it happen and feel, underneath the laughter or alongside it, something that functions like recognition and something else that functions like solidarity. The solidarity is the part that does not get talked about enough in discussions of why Family Guy has lasted as long as it has and retained the audience it has retained. Solidarity with characters who are imperfect and frequently unkind and genuinely trying and consistently falling short. Solidarity with the experience of being in relationships that contain real love and real failure in proportions that do not resolve cleanly into either a happy story or a sad one. Solidarity with the particular human condition of caring about people who are not always equipped to care back in the ways that are needed, and continuing anyway, and the continuing being its own form of love even when it does not look like love from the outside. Family Guy has never been a show about good people. It has been explicit about this from the beginning and has never retreated from it, but it has always been a show about people who keep trying in their limited and frequently self-defeating ways, and the keeping trying is what the show has always been most interested in, even when the surface content is a cutaway gag, or a Peter fight, or a Stewie scheme, or a Meg dismissal. Underneath all of those things, in every season and every era of the show's long run, is the same basic observation being made again and again, in different registers and different combinations. People are like this. Families are like this. Friendships are like this. And the being like this does not end the families or the friendships. It is simply what they contain. It is the weather inside the constant of the coming back. Seth MacFarlane created something in 1999 that he could not have fully predicted the shape of. A show designed to be a loud and irreverent and boundary-pushing animated comedy for adults became, across its extraordinarily long run, an accidental document of American domestic life in the early 21st century. Accidental because the documentary quality was never the primary intention. The primary intention was comedy, and the comedy has always been real and often genuinely excellent. But 25 years of depicting the same family in the same house with the same patterns of failure and recovery has produced, whether intentionally or not, something that goes beyond comedy into territory that is harder to name and more valuable for being harder to name. The betrayals that have been examined across this video are real. They are in the show. Peter's neglect of Lois is real. Brian's consistent gap between self-presentation and behavior is real. The show's treatment of Meg is real, and it carries a cost that the show was aware of and chose to pay anyway. The death and resurrection of Brian is real, and the strategic quality of that decision is real, alongside the genuine emotion in the episodes themselves. The friendship group's limitations are real. The show's broader treatment of its own characters as instruments is real. All of these things are in the record, and they do not disappear, because the show has also produced genuine warmth and genuine craft and genuine moments of emotional honesty across the same run. Both things are the show: the betrayals and the warmth, the cynicism and the care, the cutaway that prevents the moment from fully landing, and the occasional moment that the show allows to land without interruption. The decision to spend the characters and the decision in the same episodes to honor what those characters had become. Family Guy contains all of these things simultaneously and has never resolved the tension between them, because the tension between them is the truth of what it is depicting, which is the unresolved and unresolvable mixture of love and failure that constitutes most actual human relationships. That is what the show was really saying. From the first episode to the most recent, underneath every joke and every cutaway and every season of Meg absorbing what she should not have had to absorb, and every Brian failure dressed in the clothing of good intentions, and every Stewie scheme pointed at a mother he could not simply say he needed, and every bar scene at the Drunken Clam where four men who love each other in their limited way occupied the same stools and failed to be available to each other in the ways that mattered most. Underneath all of it, the same thing being said in the only language the show knew how to use, which was the language of comedy and dysfunction and the relentless, exhausting, genuine, imperfect, continuing attempt to be in relationship with other people despite everything that makes it difficult. The house is still standing, the family is still there, the bar is still open, and the stools are still occupied. Peter will be back next week. So will Lois and Meg and Brian and Stewie and Joe and Quagmire and Cleveland. They will all come back the way they have always come back, the way the people watching them come back to their own houses and their own families and their own imperfect and genuine and continuing relationships. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.